Welcome, dear friends, to a story of love, loss, and redemption, where an unexpected journey leads to discover the true meaning of family and second chances. Enjoy the story. Dr. Andrew Anderson slumped into his chair, his scrubs wrinkled and his face lined with exhaustion. Another grueling shift at the hospital had come to an end, but the satisfaction of saving lives made it all worthwhile. "Great work today, Dr. Anderson," a young nurse said, popping her head into his office. "You're a real hero around here." Andrew waved off the compliment, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Just doing my job, Emily, but thank you." He stood up, stretching his aching muscles. It had been a long day, filled with challenging surgeries and emergency procedures. But that was life in rural Alaska. Never a dull moment, and always someone in need of his skills. As he made his way down the hall, another nurse approached him, her face pinched with concern. "Dr. Anderson, I'm sorry to bother you, but we have a situation with one of your patients. Mr. Johnson in room 305 is refusing to take his medication." Andrew sighed, running a hand through his tousled hair. "I'll handle it, Sarah. Thanks for letting me know." He walked into room 305, his voice calm and soothing as he spoke to the agitated patient. Within minutes, he had diffused the situation, his bedside manner as impressive as his surgical skills. Just as he was about to head home for some much-needed rest, his pager buzzed with an urgent message. The head of the department needed to see him, stat. Andrew knocked on the door of Dr. Simmons's office, his heart pounding with a mix of curiosity and trepidation. It was rare for the head of the department to summon him so urgently, especially after such a long shift. "Come in," Dr. Simmons called, his voice gruff and businesslike. Andrew stepped inside, his eyes widening at the sight of the man seated across from Dr. Simmons. He was older, with silver hair and a face lined with worry, but there was no mistaking the aura of wealth and power that surrounded him. "Dr. Anderson, thank you for coming so quickly," Dr. Simmons said, gesturing for Andrew to take a seat. "This is Michael Davenport, a very important patient of ours. He has a situation that requires your immediate attention." Andrew nodded, his mind already racing with possibilities. "Of course, Dr. Simmons. What can I do to help?" Michael leaned forward, his eyes intense and pleading. "It's my granddaughter, Sophia. She's gone into labor with twins, but she's in a remote location about 100 miles from here. I need you to take a helicopter and get to her as soon as possible." Andrew's eyes widened with surprise. "A helicopter? But sir, I'm not sure if I'm qualified to—" Dr. Simmons cut him off with a wave of his hand. "You're the best we have, Dr. Anderson, and time is of the essence. Mr. Davenport has already arranged for a helicopter to take you and one of our surgical nurses to the location. You'll have all the equipment you need to handle the delivery." Andrew took a deep breath, his mind spinning with the magnitude of the task before him. But he knew he couldn't refuse, not when a life was on the line. "I'll do it," he said, his voice steady and determined. "Just give me a few minutes to gather my things." Michael stood up, his face etched with relief and gratitude. "Thank you, Dr. Anderson. You have no idea how much this means to me. I'll make sure you're well compensated for your efforts." Andrew shook his head, a small smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "That won't be necessary, sir. I'm just doing my job." As he walked out of the office, his heart racing with adrenaline, Andrew couldn't shake the feeling that this was no ordinary mission. Something told him that his life was about to change in ways he never could have imagined. The helicopter blades whirred overhead as Andrew and Maria, the surgical nurse assigned to the mission, settled into their seats. The pilot gave them a brief rundown of the flight plan, his voice crackling over the headset. "We should be at the location in about an hour," he said, his tone businesslike and efficient. "The weather looks clear, but there's always a chance of turbulence out here in the wilderness." Andrew nodded, his eyes scanning the rugged landscape below. It was a beautiful day, with the sun glinting off the snow-capped mountains and the vast expanse of the tundra stretched out before them. As the helicopter lifted off, Andrew found himself studying Maria out of the corner of his eye. She was a striking woman, with aristocratic features and a regal bearing that seemed out of place in the rugged Alaskan wilderness. "So, Maria," he said, his voice raised to be heard over the roar of the blades. "How long have you been a surgical nurse?" Maria glanced over at him, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "About 10 years now. I started out in the city, but I always felt like something was missing. When I heard about the opportunity to work in rural Alaska, I jumped at the chance." Andrew nodded, impressed by her dedication. "It's not an easy life out here. What made you decide to take on such a challenging role?" Maria's smile faded, a flicker of pain crossing her face. "I'm a single mother," she said, her voice barely audible over the noise of the helicopter. "My son, he's 6 years old. I wanted to give him a better life, away from the chaos and the crime of the city, and I wanted to make a difference, to use my skills to help people who really needed it." Andrew felt a pang of sympathy for the woman beside him. He knew all too well the sacrifices that came with their line of work, the toll it could take on personal relationships and family life. As the helicopter hit a patch of turbulence, jostling them in their seats, Andrew's mind drifted to memories of his own past. Memories of Gail, the woman he had loved and lost, the woman who had disappeared from his life without a trace. He could still see her face, still hear her laughter echoing in his mind. They had been so happy together, so in love. But then, on that fateful night, everything had changed. Andrew squeezed his eyes shut, trying to block out the painful memories. He had been working late at the hospital, exhausted and stressed from a particularly challenging case. When Gail had stopped by to surprise him with dinner, she had caught him in a compromising position with her best friend, Natalie. It had been a mistake, a moment of weakness brought on by exhaustion and desperation. But Gail had never given him a chance to explain, never answered his calls or responded to his messages. She had simply vanished, leaving him with a broken heart and a lifetime of regrets. As the helicopter soared over the rugged terrain, Andrew couldn't help but wonder what had become of Gail. Where was she now? Had she found happiness, started a family of her own? Or was she still out there somewhere, haunted by the same memories that plagued his dreams? He shook his head, trying to clear his mind of the painful thoughts. He had a job to do, a life to save. He couldn't afford to be distracted by the ghosts of his past. But as the helicopter descended towards the remote estate, the sense of unease that had been growing in the pit of his stomach only intensified. Something told him that this mission was about to take a turn he never could have predicted, a turn that would change his life forever. As the helicopter touched down on the sprawling lawn of the estate, Andrew's eyes widened with amazement. The house was a modern marvel, all sleek lines and gleaming glass, a stark contrast to the rugged wilderness that surrounded it. Michael Davenport was waiting for them as they disembarked, his face etched with worry and desperation. "Dr. Anderson, thank God you're here," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "Please, you have to save her. I'll give you anything, any amount of money you want. Just please, save my granddaughter." Andrew placed a reassuring hand on the older man's shoulder, his voice calm and steady. "I'll do everything in my power to help Sophia, Mr. Davenport. Now, can you show us to her room?" As they hurried into the house, Maria following close behind with the medical equipment, Andrew couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The house was too quiet, too still, as if a pall of tragedy hung over the place. And then, as they entered the living room, he saw it. There, on the mantelpiece, was a photograph of himself, surrounded by a black mourning frame. Andrew froze, his heart pounding in his chest. What was going on here? Why was his picture in this house displayed like a memorial to the dead? But there was no time to ponder the mystery. From upstairs, a scream of pain echoed through the house, followed by a desperate cry for help. "Sophia!" Michael whispered, his face draining of color. "We have to hurry." Andrew burst into the bedroom, his eyes widening at the sight before him. Sophia lay on the bed, her face contorted with pain, her body writhing with the force of her contractions. She was young, no more than 18 or 19, with long dark hair and delicate features that were pinched with agony. Beside her, A man who could only be the father of her children paced back and forth, his face a mask of worry and fear. "Dr. Anderson, thank God," the man said, rushing forward to shake Andrew's hand. "I'm Ethan, Sophia's boyfriend. Please, you have to help her. The contractions are getting closer together, and I don't know what to do." Andrew nodded, his mind already racing with the steps he needed to take. "Ethan, I need you to stay calm and follow my instructions. Maria, let's get the equipment set up and assess the situation." As Maria began unpacking the medical supplies, Andrew turned his attention to Sophia, his voice gentle and reassuring. "Sophia, my name is Dr. Anderson. I'm here to help you deliver your baby safely. Can you tell me how long you've been in labor?" Sophia looked up at him, her eyes glazed with pain and exhaustion. "I don't know," she whispered, her voice hoarse and strained. "A few hours, maybe. It's all a blur." Andrew frowned, his brow furrowing with concern. "Sophia, have you been receiving regular prenatal care throughout your pregnancy?" Sophia shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "My grandfather, he doesn't trust doctors. He said I didn't need to see anyone, that everything would be fine." Andrew's jaw clenched with anger and frustration. How could Michael have been so negligent, so reckless with his own granddaughter's health? But there was no time to dwell on that now. Sophia's contractions were coming faster and harder, and Andrew knew they had to act quickly. "Maria, I need you to monitor Sophia's vital signs and the baby's heart rates," he said, his voice calm and authoritative. "Ethan, I need you to hold Sophia's hand and help her through the contractions. Encourage her to breathe deeply and push when I tell her to." For the next hour, the room was a flurry of activity, punctuated by Sophia's screams of pain and Andrew's commands. It was a difficult delivery, with the twins in distress and Sophia growing weaker by the minute. But Andrew refused to give up. He worked tirelessly, his hands steady and his mind focused, determined to bring these new lives into the world safely. And then, with a final push and a cry of triumph, the first baby emerged, followed quickly by his brother. Andrew held them up, marveling at the miracle of life, at the tiny, perfect creatures he had helped to create. "Congratulations, Sophia," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "You have two beautiful, healthy boys." Sophia's face lit up with joy and wonder, tears streaming down her cheeks as she reached out to take her sons into her arms. "Thank you, Dr. Anderson," she whispered, her voice hoarse with exhaustion and gratitude. "Thank you for everything." Andrew smiled, his heart swelling with pride and accomplishment. But even as he basked in the glow of the moment, he couldn't shake the sense of unease that had been growing in the pit of his stomach. There were too many questions left unanswered, too many mysteries waiting to be unraveled. And as he looked down at the tiny, innocent faces of Sophia's sons, he knew that his journey was only just beginning. As Sophia and the twins were loaded into the helicopter, ready to be transported back to the hospital for further care, Andrew pulled Michael aside, his face etched with anger and frustration. "Mr. Davenport, I need to have a word with you," he said, his voice low and controlled. "In private." Michael nodded, his face pale and drawn as he followed Andrew into the study, closing the door behind them. "How could you let this happen?" Andrew demanded, his voice shaking with barely suppressed rage. "How could you neglect your own granddaughter's health, put her life and the lives of her babies at risk?" Michael sank into a chair, his head in his hands. "I was scared," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Scared of losing her like I lost her mother." Andrew's brow furrowed with confusion. "Her mother? What are you talking about?" Michael looked up at him, his eyes filled with tears. "Gail," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "My daughter, Gail. She died giving birth to Sophia 18 years ago." Andrew felt like the ground had dropped out from beneath him, his mind reeling with shock and disbelief. Gail, his Gail, had been pregnant? Had given birth to a daughter before she disappeared from his life forever? "But how?" he whispered, his voice hoarse and strained. "Why didn't she tell me? Why did she leave?" Michael shook his head, a bitter smile twisting his lips. "She didn't want you to know," he said, his voice harsh and accusing. "She told me before she died that Sophia's father was dead, that she wanted to raise her daughter on her own, away from the pain and the heartbreak of the past. Andrew felt like he had been punched in the gut, the air rushing out of his lungs in a single painful gasp. All this time, he had thought Gail had left him because of his betrayal, because of his moment of weakness with Natalie. But the truth was so much worse. She had left him because she was pregnant, because she had given birth to his child, and then died before he ever had a chance to know the truth. "That picture," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The one on the mantelpiece. Where did you get it?" Michael's face hardened, his eyes flashing with anger. "After Gail died, I found it among her things. A picture of you, the man who had broken her heart, the man who had driven her away from everything she loved." He stood up, his fists clenched at his sides. "I blamed you, Dr. Anderson. I blamed you for my daughter's death, for the pain and the suffering she endured in her final months. And I swore that I would never let another doctor near my family again. Never let them hurt the ones I loved the way you hurt Gail." Andrew felt like he couldn't breathe, like the walls of the room were closing in on him. All this time, he had been a father, a grandfather, and he had never even known it. And now, as he looked at the man before him, the man who had lost his daughter and his wife to the cruel twists of fate, he felt a wave of sympathy and understanding wash over him. "I'm sorry, Mr. Davenport," he said, his voice soft and sincere. "I'm sorry for your loss, for the pain that my actions caused your family. But I swear to you, I never meant to hurt Gail. I loved her with all my heart." Michael's face softened, a flicker of understanding crossing his features. "I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I know that now, and I'm sorry too, for blaming you all these years, for letting my anger and my grief cloud my judgment." He held out his hand, a peace offering in the face of so much pain and loss. "Can you ever forgive me, Dr. Anderson? Can we start over for the sake of Sophia and her children?" Andrew took his hand, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Of course," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "Of course we can. We're family now, after all." 2 weeks later, Andrew stood in the hospital room, his heart swelling with pride and joy as he watched Sophia cradle her sons in her arms. The twins had made a full recovery, thanks to the expert care of the hospital staff and Andrew's tireless efforts. And Sophia, too, had blossomed under the love and support of her newfound family, her face glowing with happiness and contentment. "I can't believe they're really mine," she whispered, her voice filled with wonder. "I can't believe I get to be their mother, after everything that's happened." Andrew smiled, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. "You're going to be an amazing mother, Sophia. I have no doubt about that." Sophia looked up at him, her eyes shining with tears. "Thank you, Dr. Anderson, for everything you've done for us, for me. I don't know what I would have done without you." Andrew shook his head, his heart swelling with emotion. "You don't have to thank me, Sophia. You're family now, and family takes care of each other." He glanced over at Michael, who was standing in the corner of the room, his face a mix of joy and apprehension. "Speaking of family, have you given any thought to where you're going to go when you leave the hospital?" Sophia bit her lip, her brow furrowing with uncertainty. "I don't know," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't go back to the estate, not after everything that's happened, but I don't have anywhere else to go." Andrew's heart clenched with sympathy and determination. He knew what it was like to feel lost and alone, to have nowhere to turn in a time of crisis. "You can stay with me," he said, his voice soft but firm. "I have plenty of room, and I want to be there for you and the boys. We can figure out the rest as we go along." Sophia's face lit up with gratitude and relief, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Really? You would do that for us?" Andrew nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Of course I would. You're my daughter, Sophia, and those boys are my grandsons. I want to be a part of your lives in whatever way I can." Michael stepped forward, his face etched with a mix of emotions. "I want that too," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I know I haven't always been the best grandfather, Sophia. I know I've made mistakes, and I've let my fear and my grief control me for too long." He took a deep breath. his eyes filled with tears. "But I want to make things right, if you'll let me. I want to be there for you and the boys, to watch them grow up and be a part of their lives." Sophia hesitated for a moment, her eyes searching her grandfather's face. And then, slowly, she nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "I'd like that, Grandpa," she said, her voice soft and sincere. "I'd like that a lot." Michael's face lit up with joy and relief, and he stepped forward to embrace his granddaughter, careful not to disturb the sleeping babies in her arms. As Andrew watched the heartwarming scene unfold before him, he felt a sense of peace and contentment wash over him. For so long, he had been haunted by the ghosts of his past, by the pain and the regret of losing Gail and the life they had planned together. But now, as he looked at the family he had found, at the love and the laughter that filled the room, he knew that everything had happened for a reason, that the twists and turns of fate had brought him to this moment, to this place of healing and redemption. And as he stepped forward to join in the embrace, his arms wrapping around his daughter and his grandsons, he knew that he had finally found the home and the family he had been searching for all along. 2 months later, Andrew sat on the porch of his house, a cup of coffee in his hands, and a contented smile on his face. The sun was just beginning to rise over the mountains, casting a warm golden glow over the world. Birds chirped in the trees, and the air was filled with the sweet scent of wildflowers and fresh dew. It had been a whirlwind of a summer, filled with laughter and love and the joyful chaos of a growing family. Sophia, Ethan, and the twins had settled into their new life with Andrew. Michael, too, had become a regular visitor, his face lighting up with joy every time he held his great-grandsons in his arms. The pain and the grief of the past had begun to fade, replaced by a sense of hope and healing that filled the air like a gentle breeze. As Andrew sipped his coffee, his mind drifted to the future, to the endless possibilities that lay ahead. He knew that there would be challenges and obstacles to face, that life was never a straight and easy path. But he also knew that he was no longer alone, that he had a family to love and support him through whatever lay ahead. And that knowledge filled him with a sense of peace and contentment that he had never known before. His thoughts turned to Maria, the surgical nurse who had been by his side through the most difficult and rewarding moments of his career. He had always admired her strength and her compassion, the way she faced every challenge with grace and determination. And lately, he had begun to feel a stirring in his heart, a spark of something deeper and more profound than simple admiration. He found himself thinking of her more and more, of the way her eyes sparkled when she laughed, of the gentle touch of her hand on his arm. He knew that it was too soon, that he needed time to heal and to grow before he could open his heart to love again. But he also knew that life was short and that every moment was precious. And so, as he drained the last of his coffee and stood up to face the day, he made a decision. He would take things slow, but he would not let fear hold him back. He would embrace the future, whatever it might bring. With a smile on his face and a spring in his step, Andrew walked back into the house, ready to face whatever lay ahead. And as he did, he couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement and anticipation, a feeling that the best was yet to come. For he knew that with love and family by his side, anything was possible, and he couldn't wait to see what the future held. 1 year later, Andrew stood at the altar, his heart pounding with joy and nervousness as he watched Maria walk down the aisle, a vision in white. She was radiant, her face glowing with happiness and love as she took her place beside him, her hand slipping into his like it was always meant to be there. As the ceremony began, Andrew's mind drifted back over the past year, over the incredible journey that had brought them to this moment. He thought of Sophia and Ethan, who had welcomed a baby girl into the world just a few months earlier, their family growing and thriving with each passing day. He thought of Michael, who had become a beloved patriarch, his face etched with lines of laughter and joy as he watched his great-grandchildren play and grow. And he thought of Maria, the woman who had captured his heart and his soul, who had shown him that love and happiness were still possible, even after all the pain and the loss of the past. As they exchanged their vows, their voices filled with emotion and sincerity, Andrew felt a sense of peace and contentment wash over him. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't always be easy, that there would be challenges and obstacles to face. But he also knew that with Maria by his side, and with the love and support of his family, he could weather any storm. That together, they could build a life filled with joy and laughter and endless possibilities. And as they sealed their love with a kiss, the crowd erupting in cheers and applause, Andrew knew that he had finally found his home, that he had finally found the happiness and the love that he had been searching for all along. For he knew that life was a precious gift, and that every moment was a chance to love and to be loved in return. And he was ready to embrace that gift, with all his heart and all his soul. As they walked back down the aisle, hand in hand, ready to face the future together, Andrew couldn't help but smile. For he knew that no matter what lay ahead, he had everything he needed, right there by his side. And that was the greatest gift of all.